Over the past decade, the popularity of so-called bubble tea has grown exponentially both in the United States and around the world. Bubble tea is a tea-based beverage with large amounts of added sugar and artificial flavors. Its signature feature is glutinous starchy balls. The number of bubble tea shops in the US has increased almost tenfold over the past decade, reaching an estimated 5,500 in 2023. This includes both independent shops and large multinational chains. But this pales in comparison to China, which is the world's largest bubble tea market. Currently, there are an estimated 400,000 bubble tea stores in the country, generating more than $14 billion of revenue in 2023. This has become big business, and according to Bloomberg, 6 of the largest bubble tea chains in China are currently planning to list their shares on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. In this video, we'll look at how bubble tea became so popular around the world, and what we can expect from the industry going forward. Bubble tea was invented in Taiwan in the 1980s. Bubble tea starts off with black tea as its base. Either milk or a high-fat cream is added. Sugar is also added. Typically, an artificial flavoring syrup is added. And finally, the defining part of the bubble tea is the black tapioca pearls. Tapioca pearls are made from the cassava root vegetable, which is grown in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. The cassava root is processed and cooked with brown sugar to turn them into soft black spheres. Egg pudding and sweetened jello can also be added to the drink. Bubble tea was introduced to the United States by Taiwanese immigrants primarily in the Los Angeles area. Bubble tea's popularity really started to explode in the 2010s with the rise of social media. Due to the heavy use of cream and artificial food coloring, the bubble tea can look far more interesting than any other drink. This makes for Instagram-worthy pictures. In recent years, there's been an explosion of bubble tea-related videos on TikTok, which has increased its popularity further. Since 2014, the number of bubble tea shops in the United States has increased 12-fold, from 473 to 5,555. Bubble tea shops keep a large number of artificial flavorings in stock. There are also many different flavors of tapioca pearls. Because the drinks are made in real time, the customer can customize their drink to a far greater extent than most other beverages. The highly customizable nature of bubble tea makes the experience far more interesting. This makes viable, dedicated bubble tea shops that sell nothing else. The final reason for bubble tea's popularity is its high fat and sugar content, which give it a desirable taste. According to research published in the Food Science Nutrition Journal, a typical 16-ounce serving of bubble tea has about 300 calories and 38 grams of sugar. This is roughly the same amount of sugar in a can of Coke, but double the calories. Bubble tea's high caloric density is mainly due to the high fat content of the dairy creams, as well as egg pudding, which is often added. Bubble tea is relatively easy to make. The milk, tea, sugar, and artificial flavorings are abundant and cheap. The only exotic ingredient is the tapioca pearls made from cassava roots. These too are pretty cheap. For example, on Amazon you can buy a 40-pound bag of tapioca pearls for $128. That translates to about 26 cents for a typical serving. There are no publicly traded bubble tea chains in the US, but we can get some pretty good estimates about store-level economics by looking at the profitability of individual franchises. For example, I found a listing of someone wanting to sell a Ding Tea franchise in El Monte, California, with an asking price of $85,000. In the listing, they provide some basic disclosures about their financial performance in the past year. In 2023, they generated $320,000 of revenue and operating cash flow of $55,000. I was able to find their menu on TripAdvisor. Milk tea costs $3.65 for a regular cup and $4.20 for a large. Most people presumably get the pearls, as that's the main point of bubble tea. This adds another 55 cents, bringing the total up to $4.20 for a regular and $4.75 for a large. Let's say on average they make $4.50 per cup. In addition to selling in store, you can also order from Ding Tea on delivery platforms like Grubhub and DoorDash. The prices on Grubhub are about $2 higher than if you order in store. Ding Tea passes the delivery platform fee onto the consumer. They probably make a similar profit whether you order in store or online. Let's assume 30% of their orders are delivery. To get $32,000 of revenue, they would have to sell 45,000 cups in store at $4.50 each, and 18,000 via delivery at $6.50 each. They are open 6 hours per day on weekdays and 8 hours per day Friday through Sunday. That's 48 hours per week, or about 2,400 hours per year. This means they sell about 25 cups per hour, or 1 cup every 2.4 minutes. That is pretty impressive throughput. Let's assume the cost of materials is 30% of gross revenue, which is industry standard. $2 per cup of platform delivery fees for online orders will cost $36,000 per year in total. In the listing, they disclose that their rent is $2,700 per month, or $32,000 per year. The minimum wage in California is $16 per hour. Assuming they have 2 employees at any given time, that should cost $77,000 per year. Utilities and insurance might cost $12,000. Finally, Ding Tea is a franchise. They charge about 3% of gross revenue as a franchise royalty. In this example, that would come out to roughly $10,000 per year. This brings our operating profit to $57,000. We adjusted our assumptions to match with the $55,000 of operating cash flow advertised in the listing, so we're probably pretty close to the truth. $55,000 is the annual operating cash flow of the Ding Tea franchise, but we still need to consider depreciation. While they don't own the real estate, they do own the furniture and equipment, which will eventually need to be replaced. Since it's a Ding Tea franchise, you're probably required to buy your equipment through them, or at least through an approved supplier. They don't publicly disclose how much this costs. I was able to find one Reddit user who started their own bubble tea shop in Germany. They say equipment and furnishings cost them 50 to 60,000 euros, but you might be able to get away with 30 to 40,000. Let's be conservative and say it costs $70,000 for equipment and furnishing. Buying equipment from a franchise will likely be slightly more expensive than an independent shop. If we assume an estimated useful life of 7 years, that's $10,000 of depreciation expense per year. So this Ding Tea franchise in El Monte, California, is probably making $45,000 per year of net profit after depreciation. While that's not bad, it's also not great. Consider that this is a very high volume bubble tea shop selling 1 cup every 2.4 minutes when it's open. It makes sense that profit margins are low given the low barriers to entry. It's extremely easy for anyone to set up an independent bubble tea shop. Anyone can order bubble tea making equipment from Chinese e-commerce platforms like Alibaba. And there are numerous wholesalers across the US that can supply you with the necessary raw ingredients. Staffing requirements are relatively low compared to other restaurants, making bubble tea shops easy to manage. In many cases, the owner of the bubble tea shop and their family may also work there as staff. This way, they don't need to hire external staff. A family might be able to scrape by operating their own bubble tea shop, even if it's not generating enough profits to hire outside employees. Now we'll turn our attention to China. With over 400,000 locations, it is the largest bubble tea market in the world by far. The bubble tea industry in China is highly developed, boasting numerous chains with thousands of locations each, as well as tens of thousands of independent shops. In 2023, bubble tea revenue in China is estimated to have reached $14 billion. Last year, Bloomberg reported that 6 of the largest bubble tea chains in China were planning to list their shares on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Poor market sentiment delayed these planned IPOs. On April 23, 2024, one of these bubble tea chains called Cha Bai Dao finally pulled the trigger on its long-planned IPO. Cha Bai Dao is the 4th largest bubble tea chain in China, with over 6,000 locations. The IPO was a huge disappointment. They priced their shares at $17.50 each. On the first day of trading, the share price fell to as low as $11.18. It closed the day at $12.80, 27% below its listing price. As a newly listed company, we don't have a lot of financial data to work with. But we can get a sense of what's probably going on by looking at another Chinese bubble tea chain called Nayuki. Nayuki is much smaller, only having about 1,600 locations across China. It IPO'd back in 2021, and its share price has declined by more than 80% since then. Starting around 2022, the Chinese bubble tea market became fiercely competitive, with thousands of new shops popping up every month. This forced Nayuki to reduce the prices of its bubble tea from the equivalent of $4 per cup down to $2. In 2023, they generated the equivalent of $450,000 per store. Their cost of materials was 36% of revenue. Staff salaries were 27%. Rent cost 14%. More than 40% of their orders were placed through online delivery services, which charge significant fees. This cost 8% of revenue. Finally, utilities were 3% of revenue. Each store generated $58,000 of cash flow for a 13% store-level margin. But they also had depreciation expense of $26,000. They own their own brand, so they don't have to pay franchise royalties, but they do spend 3% of their revenue on advertising and 5% on corporate overhead. After deducting these expenses, they generated a slight loss of about $6,000 per store. You might have noticed that Nayuki's revenue per store is actually higher than the Ding Tea franchise that we looked at earlier in El Monte, California. Yet the El Monte Ding Tea is profitable while Nayuki is losing money. The Nayuki stores are much larger than the El Monte Ding Tea. Based on their prices and revenue per store, the El Monte Ding Tea likely sells about 220 cups per day. The average Noyuki shop sells almost 3 times as much, at 620 per day. Despite wages being much lower in China, Noyuki's labor expense is higher than Dingti's. This is because each Noyuki shop requires significantly more staff. The cost of raw materials as a percentage of revenue is greater at Noyuki. Intense competition in China has pushed down the selling price of bubble tea. Noyuki's depreciation is 6% of revenue. This is double what we estimated for Dingti. American bubble tea shops can import machines from China at roughly the same cost. Because retail prices of bubble tea are much higher in the US, you generate much higher revenue per machine. This means that depreciation expense will be smaller as a percentage of revenue. And finally, because Noyuki is a large chain, they have significant corporate overhead. An individual franchise owner doesn't have corporate overhead. With all that being said, Noyuki is almost breaking even. If it weren't for the corporate overhead, they would actually have a small profit. The bubble tea market in China has clearly become oversaturated. Intense competition has pushed down prices to the point where large chains find it difficult to make a profit. This explains the poor share price performance of the two publicly traded bubble tea chains. If bubble tea's popularity continues to increase, there's no reason the market couldn't become just as saturated in the US. While the number of bubble tea stores may continue to increase, it's probably not going to be an industry where large corporations can make billions of dollars of profit. The bubble tea shops that survive in the long run will likely be family-run businesses who can keep their staffing costs low. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about bubble tea? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.